Well, at CNET we had live streamings. Okay, everybody, thank you for coming tonight. It's the San Francisco MySQL meetup. And first I'll start off with our sponsors because I have to get that out of the way. Percona has been our long-term, our first sponsor, I believe, and they provided the food tonight. And Lithium is our sponsor of, so they're hosting us with all this fancy technology that allows us to take it online and have this kind of nice screen and all that. And then Vendini sponsors us by me, so they're our sponsor, and I have some Vendini t-shirts. And I don't know if we're raffling off any O'Reilly, but O'Reilly does sponsor all tech meetups, and if you have a tech meetup and you're not using O'Reilly, and I'll be glad to give you the contact because it's great to have books to raffle off. Occasionally Percona gives us some extra books to raffle off, but they go like hotcakes, so we don't have any tonight. And I think that's all the announcements. Mike, do you have any announcements? Probably. So does anybody? So is anybody looking to hire people? Are you guys?
We are, yes. Yeah, I'll get to that at the end, but we are.
And is anybody here looking to be hired? So. And also, does anybody have any announcements? We always open it up to announcements so long as they're not longer than 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, so I feel really lucky to have Ike here to talk about toolbox stuff because I needed to talk on toolbox stuff right now in my job. So it's perfect timing. And it's also great that it's not going to be a beginning talk. So that's also great because I don't know how many beginning toolbox talks I've sat through. And they're kind of boring, and I end up playing solitaire because I know everything. So it's really great. And now I'm going to pass it off to Ike, and thanks for being here.
All right. Thank you very much, Erin. And thanks to Darren and Mike, also the other organizers. So thank you guys so much for having me. Thanks, everybody, for turning up. So the first thing I always wonder when I see somebody getting up to give a talk about this database is how they're going to pronounce it. So I'll keep you guys in suspense for a minute to find out which way I pronounce it. I'm sure it's the wrong way. In fact, actually, when I gave this talk at Percona Live last year, I took a poll in the audience to see which way I was going to pronounce it. And I was convinced that everybody was going to want me to pronounce it MySQL. But it was actually split down the middle about 50-50. So I just ended up saying MySQL because that's the way I've always said it. I sort of blame my college professor who taught a database course and taught me about Microsoft SQL Server to begin with. So anyways, my name's Ike Walker. The talk I'm going to give tonight is called Assembling the Perfect MySQL Toolbox. So let's, and yeah, as Erin said, this is, when I gave this talk at Percona Live, and I'm giving it again at Percona Live this year, I advertised it as a beginner talk. Erin asked me to make it intermediate, which I'm happy to do. And really, you know, this talk isn't about showing you how to use a couple of tools. It's not about showing you a tool that I wrote. It's more about a methodology that I follow in order to take some of the great open source tools that are in the MySQL ecosystem and, you know, be a good citizen, figure out how to use them, teach other people how to use them. So it's you know, it's really much more about methodology, which I think is appropriate as an intermediate talk. So there we are. A couple things about Flite, the company I work for. So over in the corner there is a group of folks from Flite. We are a San Francisco-based company. We were founded in 2006. We're an advertising technology startup. And you can build a lot of really cool ads. Oh, the one slide I changed here. So we're mostly based in San Francisco, as I said. We've also got sales in New York, and we've got sales and design in Chicago. And when I was on this slide before, Boston was missing. And since I actually live in Boston, I am the Boston office of Flite. You know, I flew out of a major snowstorm to get here, so I felt I would have been remiss to leave Boston off the slide. So I added Boston. Sorry, Giles, I changed the slides on you, but this is our company. So we've got a platform where you can make really awesome ads. These are some of our customers. You probably recognize a few of those brands. And so a couple of things just about the way we use MySQL, our specific setup. I think this is kind of relevant sometimes when we talk about it. So we're running Percona Server. We're on on 5.6. I remember, in fact, the day that we upgraded to 5.6. It was very memorable because it was May 6th. So for those of us in the United States, May 6th is 5.6. So I thought it was pretty cool that that was the day we got onto 5.6. I feel like we were kind of early on the 5.6 train, so sometimes I like to talk about that a little bit. We run at AWS. We're almost all in ODB. There's a couple of things still in my ISAM that I'm fighting to get off of. We're in multiple regions because we got customers all over the world. And as with everybody else, we've got other data stores. We use Hive for our batch metrics. We use Redis for our real-time metrics. We use Cassandra for any data that we capture in the ad unit itself. So a little bit about me. So I've been working at Flite since 2007. You can follow me on Twitter at IOWalker. I don't tweet that much, so I won't pollute your stream too much. And I blog at the company's engineering blog, and it's mostly about MySQL. So you should check that out. I'm actually going to reference a bunch of my blog posts in the talk tonight. So it's a good place to go back and get some of the gory details on those. So let's start off a little bit by talking about what is in my toolbox for working with MySQL. So these are sort of the three pillars of my toolbox. Two of the three have nice logos, so I put them in. Up top, we've got MySQL Sandbox. We've got Percona Toolkit that everybody knows. And then the third one, does anybody want to guess what that's a picture of? Nope. Any other guesses? This is easier with an East Coast crowd. They're more likely to recognize it. When I gave this talk at the Boston MySQL meetup. Yes, there you go. That is the Boston Common. And so I chose that to represent a box toolkit called Common Schema. I could have shown you a schema, but to be honest, most of the schemas I've seen in my life are really not that pretty. So I thought the Boston Common would be a little nicer. Although I should say that's obviously not a current picture because the Boston Common's buried under 5 feet of snow now. So it's more like the areas that don't have pictures. All right, so quick introduction to Percona Toolkit. I'm sure most people in this room are familiar with at least pieces of it, but one of the things about Percona Toolkit is it's got a lot of tools in it, right? So it originally was Mottkit that Baron Schwartz designed. When he was at Percona, they forked it. Daniel Nichter and some others at Percona maintain it now. So as of version 2.2.13, which came out 2 weeks ago, there's 32 tools in Percona Toolkit. So there's the full enumeration of them. I've gone out of my way to make sure I've used each of those tools at least once, just to sort of know how it works. I put a caution flag by a few of them. PT Archiver, I put that there because it deletes data. So always good to be, in case your interpretation of the word archiver doesn't include deleting data, you should be aware of that. And then PTIO profile and PTPMP are very intrusive. They can hang your server. They can crash your server. They're sort of like in case of emergency break glass kind of stuff. So if you're just going around merely using tools, I would avoid those. But yeah, so Percona Toolkit is huge. There's so many tools in it, in fact, that a couple of years ago I did an April Fool's blog post about the hidden tools of Percona Toolkit. So there was, what was it, PT Value was the one where I said you could get the spot price of platinum in different currencies. And there was PT Height, where you could get the height of the Petronas Tower in meters and furlongs and whatever units you wanted. And PT Barnum, I think, was the third one. So here's a couple of quick code examples, just because I like to have examples. As I said, there's 32 tools. There's a million different things you can do with them. But on top, this is one that I like to do, is use PT Query Digest. So the PT Query Digest can both digest your queries and tell you things about them, or it can actually look at a running server, pull the process list, and produce an output file. So one thing, if you want to capture the queries that are running on a server and then profile them, you can do that with these two lines. You can use process list, poll, set your polling interval, how long you want to run it. So in this case, I'm just getting 10 minutes of queries from a production host, putting it into a file in slow log format, and then I report on it. So that can basically show you what the most common queries that are being run on your database. So that's pretty cool. PT Kill is a good one. If you've got some queries that are running on your database, taking a long time, I think from talking to people, this seems like a tool that people use a lot. So this in particular, if you've got a that's running queries taking more than 2 minutes, it'll basically kill them all and print it. pt-config-diff is one that I like. You can pull down config the my.cnf files from 2 different servers, diff them, see what's different if they're exhibiting different behavior. So that's Percona Toolkit. I'll get back to some of that, but just as I go through the 3 pillars. Common schema was another one I talked about. This is one that I feel like is one that I'm always trying to push on people because not everybody knows about common schema or uses it, but it's a really, really powerful, really cool toolkit. So Shlomi Noach, like I said, wrote this. Percona I meant to mention is written in Perl. Common schema is all written in SQL. So you can open up the source file for it and go through 30,000 lines of stored procs and views and other cool stuff. I thought Shlomi sort of summed up what it is pretty well, so I just copied and pasted that from the documentation site. But common schema is something that I use, all the time. I blog about it a lot because I feel like it's one that I really want to educate people about and get them to learn more. So it's got this thing called query script, where you can basically run things like for loops and stuff like that, all in SQL. And that is something that I think is a really powerful concept because I feel like there's a lot of times that you're doing something in the database, you want to stay in the database, but then you have to jump out to your scripting language, in order to do a loop. But with query script, you can do it all in SQL. I should say, if anybody has any questions or comments, just feel free to interrupt, raise your hand, whatever. So these are a couple of examples also from his documentation site, if you go to the Common Schema site. So you can do a for loop. So this is going, basically you take the Sequila database, everybody's favorite sample database, and for every table it goes through and for every table in the Sequila schema, you see if the engine is in ODB, you can run an alter table on it, use the compact row format. So that's basically a one-liner doing all this dynamic stuff across all the tables in a schema. Here's another fun one that I did earlier today. So I said, Common Schema has a numbers table, which has 4,096 rows, 0 to 4,095. And so I just iterated. I did 10 times. For I from 1 to 10, I'd select ran from that table, insert it into a random number table. And I actually ran that a bunch of times and watched as the average in the table got closer and closer to 0.5. So that was kind of fun. This is one of the procs for Common Schema. It's kind of a random example, but this is a really funny thing. When I first looked at Common Schema, I realized he has a function called Easter Day. So basically, you put in a date, and it tells you what day Easter is that year. I'm still not sure why it's in there, but it's kind of a cool one to look at the code for of how he does the calculation, because it always does seem a little random every year when Easter is. So now you know the math behind it. But with the Easter Day function, if you care about when Easter is this year, April 5th, mark your calendars. So then I decided to take a couple of Common Schema concepts together. I did the Easter Day function and the numbers table to see which date was the most common date for Easter in the 20th century. And it was April 12th. Who knew? All right, MySQL Sandbox. So this is a really cool one. Giuseppe Magia wrote this. It's a really easy way to install MySQL, multiple instances of MySQL, on your laptop or wherever. So if you want to set up a replication topology with a certain version of MySQL, run some tests, it's dead simple to do it. So this is the 2 lines that Giuseppe shows you of how to install it. This is a little bit more details. This is something I ran today. So I downloaded MySQL 5.6. And then I just said make replication sandbox, pointed it at the tar file, and it set up a master with 2 slaves, and all I had to do was run this quick shell script, and I was connected to it, and I could go to town. So MySQL Sandbox is awesome for testing. I think it's a really important part of any good toolbox because when you have a new tool and you're trying to solve a problem and you're testing it out, I always go back to MySQL Sandbox to set up a test environment first so that I can try it out on that before I go into, run it on my QA or stage or anything like that. Yeah? You could, yeah. I mean, you can set up. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I haven't tried that feature, but yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. So is that mic on the feed, or shall I'll just work? Yeah. Yeah, so Erin was asking whether I've used the feature that she asked for that Giuseppe implemented of being able to use MySQL Sandbox in a QA environment where you're not giving it the tar file, you're pointing it at an existing instance.
Yeah, because we have lots of sandboxes running with different integration tests or
Yeah.
tests. And so one server can have 10, 20, as many as the hardware can support.
Yeah.
And we can set up all these different, like Jenkins or Hudson tests that run continuously and get more testing done.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds cool. I haven't tried that, but if you said you implemented it, I would give it a shot. Yeah, well, I will say, so Percona Toolkit is constantly being added to and modified. I don't think Giuseppe does a lot of active dev work on MySQL Sandbox unless there's a major version. Like I know when 5.6 came out, I think he did a lot. Or he did a lot for MariaDB, for example, but I don't know this changing. But yeah, so MariaDB is another example. I had a blog post recently about a workaround I was doing to create a unique index with more than 16 columns in it, because unique constraints in MySQL are implemented as indexes. So if you're crazy enough like me to want to have a unique constraint of more than 16 columns, it just won't do it. So I set up, added a new column that concatenated some of the columns together. And I could do it with the trigger and my load data in file statement. And somebody commented on the post and said that could be a good use case in 5.7 for virtual columns or for MariaDB virtual columns. And I was thinking it would be pretty easy to use MySQL Sandbox to test that out. I haven't gotten around to it, but that's something I intend to do soon. So like MariaDB, for example, I don't use MariaDB, but I can download the tar file and very easily spin up a sandbox to do that. So those are the 3 tools I'm going to talk about the most tonight. I did want to highlight some other great tools that are out there in the MySQL ecosystem that I don't happen to use or haven't happened to use myself. So MySQL Utilities. These come from Oracle. These are written in Python. There's a whole bunch of tools in there. It looks cool. I haven't tried it out yet. Flex Views is a very specific one by Justin Swanhart, who has spoken here before, I think. And Justin works at Percona now, I think. And so Flex Views is basically a way to implement materialized views in MySQL. So that's a cool tool. InnoTop is one that basically it's like top, the Linux command, but for InnoDB. And I think that was Baron Schwartz wrote that tool to begin with, and then some other people at Percona have worked on it. The MySQL sys schema is really, really cool performance schema. I know not a lot of people use performance schema yet, but now once you get in 5.6, you should use performance schema. And MySQL sys schema, which Mark Leith wrote, used to be called PS Helper. It's basically a lot of views to sort of simplify the interface and summarize some of the data for performance schema. So that's one I recommend. pMySQL is a tool that Domas wrote for Facebook. It's a parallel MySQL client, so you can run queries on a whole bunch of servers if you have a whole bunch of servers. I don't have that many servers, so I've never used it, but it looks cool. And then Securich was written by Darren, who's around. There's Darren. So don't ask me questions about Securich, but I'm sure Darren would love to talk about it. It's a very cool tool for sort of like very granular, more granular than grants, giving users access at table, column level, that kind of thing. Is that right? As you can see, there's a lot of great tools out there. What you want to do, what I want to talk about is how do you find the right tools to solve your problems, and what's the right way to integrate those tools into your work. So, who is the boss? Everybody, well, not everybody. Some people probably remember that TV show. But in this case, you can tell from the dots that this is the acronym I've chosen for my methodology here. So, you need to assemble your toolbox like a boss. So what that means to me is you buy the right tool, you own the tool, you sell the tool, and then success. So I'll go through that, and you'll be, just as pumped as Bruce Springsteen. So buy that. So most of these tools I'm talking about obviously are free, right? So I'm not talking about an actual cash transaction. So what do I mean by buy the right tool? Basically, I mean do your research, invest time to the tool works. Don't just go to the Percona Toolkit documentation page and find an example and copy it and paste it, right? You need to really make a commitment to the tool to at least test it and see how it works for you and decide whether you want to basically take it from out here in the internet and put it in your MySQL toolbox. So that's what I mean by buy or write tool. So what do I mean by own it? Again, I'm not talking about in a physical sense that there's some transaction, because this is all free software. So what does it mean to own these tools? So owning it really means, to me, sort of taking responsibility. That you need to try the tool, you need to test it out. I'm a big fan of looking at the code. You don't need to read the entire code base, but I think it helps to get in there. Percona Toolkit is Perl, common schema is in SQL, the MySQL Utilities are in Python. It's all pretty readable at a high level, at least to sort of get in there and kick the tires a little bit. And then the most important of these is submitting feedback, because most of these toolkits started as something that somebody wrote for their own use and then built upon and realized it would be useful to the community at large, so they shared it with us. But I'm sure everybody who's ever done that has felt like they would like to get more feedback. Nobody's ever said, I've gotten too much feedback on my toolkit. So tell people what you like, tell people what you don't like. Just the feedback loop, I feel like, is very important. So what do I mean by selling the tool? So this is one that's sort of the most important to me, is I feel like we really need to, as a MySQL community, not all of us are going to be writing these open source tools, but I think we have an obligation to sort of share knowledge with each other about the tools we're using and how we're using them. So what does that mean? So if you're at a big company where there's more, you're not the only person working with MySQL, talk to each other, show your coworkers what you're doing with the tool. If you're like me and you like to blog, then blog about the tool and show people, was this specific problem I had, this is how I fixed it. That's something I want to see more of, people blogging about the way they're using tools. And then, share your knowledge on a mailing list or on Stack Overflow. I like to jump on Stack Overflow and answer people's MySQL questions, and anytime I can get a plug-in for Common Schema or Percona Toolkit or something, I can do it, because I feel like that's, teaching people how to use these tools in a way that, they're really going to learn and benefit from long term. And then success, the last step of the boss system. So you've solved your problem, you've expanded your MySQL toolbox, it's gotten a little bit bigger. Now you can move on to the next problem. So back to who's the boss? It's not Tony, Angela. You're the boss. Following my simple 4-step system, you're now the boss. All right, so I'm going to go through the boss system by example, talk about a few things that I've done at Flite that follows this methodology, and we'll sort of see how it worked out. Okay, so example number 1 is what I call the Great Widget Box Purge. So Flite evolved from a company called Widgetbox, which was a web widget platform years and years ago. And so, eventually we realized that consumer widgets weren't our future, but being an ad platform was our future. But we had grown up on the same database schema. So eventually we had to pivot the business, but when we pivoted the business, the database was still sitting there, and 80% of the data in the database was Widgetbox data. It was all in the same schema, but it was very different. It was long-tail, consumer-focused widget data instead of, publishers and brands making ads. So I had this problem, right? I've got this database. I want to go in and delete 80% of the data, but the database wasn't small. It wasn't a trivial delete statement, and there were lots of tables to delete from. So the question I had is, how can I delete this data safely, easily, and efficiently? So I went out and looked at some tools. So everybody knows pt-archiver is one way to do that. So that was the first thing I said. Okay, I'm going to use pt-archiver to go delete this data. But then I read a blog post that Baron Schwartz wrote, basically saying, hey, if I need to do a bunch of deletes and do it in small chunks with the tool, I wouldn't use the tool I wrote. I wouldn't use pt-archiver. He said he would use Common Schema. So that was one of the first things that turned me on to Common Schema. And so I went in, I looked at the blog post, and I was like, all right, cool. I'll give Common Schema a try. So I ran a bunch of tests in our stage environment. Said we're in AWS, so I just spun up an extra copy of the production database too, and ran some deletes on there and tested it out. I did find a bug. So there was one of my tables had an extra unique index that was confusing the query script commands I was running, so it couldn't figure out how to chunk the table. So I opened a bug report, submitted it. Shlomi fixed it the same day. She figured out a workaround to do it, so I was, that was a good feeling. So then I sold it, right? So I bought this. Baron convinced me it was a thing to do. I tested it out. It was great. I purged all the data, and then I wrote a blog post about it because I felt like, other people were going to have this problem, and it would save them some time if they could read my blog post and do it. So you probably can't read that, but there's a link there for anybody who wants to see the full details on that. So then step 4 of the boss system, of course, is success, right? I optimize my tables. I use file per table, of course, and I optimize them, and now my database shrank by 80%, and I'm done, right? Almost, because I've still got the IB data file that's huge, and there's no easy way to shrink that. So you know what? It's time for me to start the boss system all over again. I did see a recent blog post about using trite and extra backup to shrink an IB data file. So I haven't tried that out yet, but there's a link to that. I'll have to do that reading as my homework and see if I can figure out how to do that. All right, example number 2. Now that I've purged all this data out of my database, how do I make sure it's consistent across my whole replication topology? So obviously this is a job for PT table checksum, right? That's part of Percona Toolkit that runs and checksums your data and then can tell you, either thumbs up, everything's good, or you've got differences. And so, of course, there's a companion tool called pt table sync that you can use to, if you're really, really feeling lucky, you can just let it rip and fix your data. Or more likely, you'll run it in the print mode where it tells you, gives you some SQL statements to do the fixes yourself. And the other thing I realized at this point, so pt table checksum, you run it on the master, it does the checksums, and then sends those down to the slaves. But the master needs to be able to talk to the slaves to say, what's your checksum, what's my checksum, make sure they match. And the way our servers were set up, the slave could talk to the master, but the master couldn't talk to the slave. So I had to give the tool a little bit of help. So I created a table of DSNs, basically to say, these are all the databases, go get them. So in order to own it, right, I got to do a lot of testing in our stage environment. I did some more testing. I created the DSN table like I talked about before. And then one of the things I found out about in the testing is that this is a tool that's very sensitive to schema differences if you don't tell it up front about all the replicas. So that's why I'd done the DSN table, because if you just run, do I talk about that here? No. So if you just run pt table checksum on the master, it tries to find the slaves to make sure that the schemas are the same, so it's not going to send a statement on the master that's going to break replication on a slave. But if it can't find all the replicas, it just assumes everything's good and it runs. So if you've got, obviously the whole point of pt table checksum is you might have data differences, but it just assumes that you don't have any schema discrepancies. So if there's a schema discrepancy, say there's a missing column on one of your slave databases, that'll break replication. So you need to be very careful about that. Make sure you tell pt table checksum about all the slaves in your replication topology, so it can tell you if you've got a problem rather than just creating a problem on its own. And then the next thing I did, I sold it again. I wrote another blog post. In particular, this was one about a gotcha that I found in pt table sync. So the way pt table sync works to fix your data discrepancies, it doesn't do an update, it does a replace. So that you can just run the replace on the master, it'll drop down to the slave. But the thing about a replace is really a delete and then an insert. So it's not functionally equivalent to an update. So specifically, I was using an older version of pt table sync. It was back in Percona Toolkit 2.1 instead of 2.2. And so it wasn't using the no foreign key checks option as a default. So if you had a foreign key, an on-delete cascade foreign key, when the replace statement happened, it would delete the parent row and then reinsert it, but all the children would automatically get dropped by the cascade delete. So that was really dangerous. Luckily, they fixed it, so the default is no foreign key. I still said, if you're using an old version like I was, and I know some people don't always, rush to upgrade because sometimes they make changes that break things. In newer versions, that was a really important flag to pass. So now I've hit step 4 again. Success. I can sync all my replicas to the master, make sure all my data is consistent. So the order in which I did these is kind of important because since I was about to delete 80% of the data in my database, I felt like that was a good, after I did the deletes, was a good time to do the checksums, because I didn't want to go do the checksums and fix a bunch of stuff in rows that I was just going to delete anyways. The timing of those two is important. Example number 3 about the boss system. So pt-online-schema-change. This is one I feel like this is possibly the most used tool, or one of the most used tools in Percona Toolkit, is pt-online-schema-change. So it's a very clever tool because it allows you to do DDL in a way, because it creates a copy of your table, keeps that copy in sync, does the schema change on the new copy, and then once it's done, it does an atomic rename. But one thing that they've always advertised in flashing lights is pt-online-schema-change doesn't work if there's any triggers on your table, because it says it's got to create its own triggers, so if you've got triggers, don't even bother applying. But the trick that, the thing that, the fine print that I'd sort of tried to point out is that the triggers that pt-online-schema-change creates are after triggers, right? Because it's after you make a change, it copies it to the other table. So if you've got your own before triggers, those should be able to work happily side by side, because those fire before, the other ones fire after, everything's happy. So for years, I've been trying to convince them that they should change it, the restriction, instead of saying no pt-online-schema-change if you have any triggers, to no pt-online-schema-change if you have after triggers. And up until now, they haven't done it. I submitted a bug and everything. So basically, I just made a 3-line patch, put it in the bug report. So I patched my own version. It's on there for anybody else who wants to try that. I don't know when they'll adopt it into the main line, but that was a pretty good example of how looking at the code can help, because it's a gigantic, ugly Perl file, but it wasn't hard to find the place where it was checking, does your table have triggers? And so that patch was pretty easy. So that's the boss system by example. So here's a few reminders to make sure you can be the boss you want to be. So don't reinvent the wheel. This is one that I'm constantly relearning, because there's so many tools that I've written for myself that then I find out that Percona Toolkit has a way to do it, or I'm writing some tooling around something from Percona Toolkit that it also does. So don't reinvent the wheel. Only use tools you understand. Don't just copy and paste an example that somebody sent, because you can end up in much worse trouble that way. And of course, test it before you use it in prod. We all know to do that. So go through those and make some examples. So these are some of the don't reinvent the wheels examples. So PT Heartbeat, a great tool in Percona Toolkit, does a heartbeat on your master table, replicates to the slaves. That way you can get a reliable indication of how far behind replication is. Seconds behind master is not reliable. PT Heartbeat's much better, and you can actually, it has tunable granularity now, so you can do 1 heartbeat per second, you can do 10 heartbeats per second, etc. You should really use the built-in checks, because I remember when we first introduced PT Heartbeat, we were doing our own queries on the heartbeat table, and we wrote our own Nagios checks, but it's all in there. You can use the PT Heartbeat tool with the -- check to check the replication delay. They've got the Percona monitoring plugins, has plugins to do the Nagios checks for you, so use as much of that as you can. Don't write it yourself unless you have to. PT table checksum is another one where, it really, PT table checksum and PT table sync are like chocolate and peanut butter, two great tastes that taste great together. Two great tastes that taste great together, so make sure you use those together. And as I said, only use tools you understand. You don't want to end up like this guy. You don't want to shoot yourself in the foot. So get to know the code. I know some people not look at the code, but in my experience, tool code is much, much more accessible than server code. It's not like you're looking at the server code. You can crack open the Perl file and get to know it. And this is sort of a personal thing of mine, is I never run the tool with the default options. I know I'm probably being overly cautious, but I feel like it's good to explicitly state as many of the options as you can. It makes the command more readable, makes you understand which way you're flipping all the toggles, and then sweat the small stuff. So there's a lot of modes in a tool which may look exactly the same, but there's subtle differences that can be huge. So an example I come up with here is pt kill. So pt kill has a few different ways you can do. You can do print, where it basically just prints out the queries. It doesn't actually kill them. You can do kill, which kills the connection, or you can do kill query, which kills the query. And depending on your application, it could be that killing the connection could be harmful, or killing the query might not be enough. So you need to know your app. You need to understand between those. A couple more examples of sweating the small stuff. is, like I mentioned before, pt table checksum. If it doesn't know about all your replicas and there's a schema difference in there, it can break your replication, which again is putting you somewhere worse than where you were before. And I also mentioned the thing about pt table sync and the cascade deletes, so watch out for that as well. So test outside of production, duh, we all know to do that. You know, you've got your whatever non-prod environments you have. As I mentioned, MySQL Sandbox is really helpful for this because you can, you know, that's sort of the first wave of testing of tools I usually do on my laptop on MySQL Sandbox. But then if you're in the cloud like we are, you know, it's super easy to spin up a disposable copy of your prod data, run whatever tests you want on it, and then spin it down. So that, you know, I'm an advocate of doing a lot of that for testing as well. So MySQL 5.6. So I talked about this. You know, things change a little bit from 5.5 to 5.6. So when we did the upgrade on May 6th, that was a good time to sort of open up the toolbox and look in and see, you know, if there were some things that that we should do a little differently in 5.6. So I'm going to touch on just a couple of those. So first question is, do we still need PT slave delay? So PT slave delay is a way to intentionally delay a slave a certain amount. You know, if you want to have a slave that's a week behind or 14 days behind, you know, in case you drop a table and don't have backups and want to recover it there, or just get some rows that get deleted or whatever. So in the old days, you had to use PT slave delay to do that, and it actually did a pretty good job of it. That was a tool that we used to keep a delayed replica. I was pretty happy with it, but do you still need it in 5.6? No, you don't, because now there's native syntax to do it. Change master to master delay, and then you give it a number of seconds. So we've changed our delayed replica. We don't use PT slave delay for it anymore now that we're in 5.6. We use the native way, and it's just easier that way because it's built in. You don't need to worry about PT slave delay if that process goes away and Monet doesn't bring it back up. I got the man page there if you want to read it, and a blog post I wrote about that as well. So next question in 5.6, do we still need pt-online-schema-change? And the answer is maybe. Depends on what you're doing. So we have online DDL in 5.6, but it's not everything. So if you're adding a column, you're renaming an index, you're adding an index, dropping, you know, it all depends. So Morgan Talker wrote a good article about, you know, basically he put a matrix out of all the different DDL commands and which ones are online and which ones aren't. So I recommend you read that, and then you can decide whether you still need pt-online-schema-change or not. Do we still need pt heartbeat? Yes. One of the things when I was first looking at 5.6, I saw this thing called master heartbeat period. And I was like, ah, cool, they've got a heartbeat built in. I don't need pt heartbeat anymore. But that's not the same at all. That's basically how often the master checks, the master or the slave, it goes one way or another, how often they check to see if they're still communicating. So that's not a replacement for pt heartbeat. Seconds behind master still sucks. Don't use seconds behind master. We still need pt heartbeat. So that's a little on 5.6. So choosing the right tool for the job. You know, we're in an advantageous position now that people are creating more tools, more toolkits are coming out. So sometimes you get to actually, rather than just like, here's the one tool that solves my problem, between multiple tools. And I think with MySQL Utilities from Oracle, this may become even more so. So how do you choose the right tool for the job? So bulk deletes. This is a showdown I already talked about. PT archiver versus common schema. PT archiver is the old way to do it. Common schema, as far as I'm concerned, is the new way to do it. You know, unless you want to, you know, PT archiver does have some advantages that you can create backups to tables or files, so maybe that's good. But in my experience, common schema is the way to go for bulk deletes. Online DDL, this is one we've talked about a little bit. So there's 3 different ways to do it now. We got pt-online-schema-change we talked about. There's Oak Online Alter Table, which is the one that that was part of OpenArtKit that Shlomi wrote, which I think pt-online-schema-change was actually based on that. I think pt-online-schema-change is going to win over Oak Online Alter Table for the most part, especially if you use my patch, because that's the main advantage of Oak Online Alter Table was that it was aware of the difference between before and after triggers. But pt-online-schema-change in general was more advanced versus alter table. So, you know, the answer now I would say for 5.6 is if you're doing something that's supported by online DDL, just run it live and you know, you should be fine. But if not, then use one of the toolkits, probably pt-online-schema-change, unless you have after triggers on your table, in which case, you know, you're sort of out of luck with online DDL. Okay, JSON parsing. So this is something that I've had to do for some reports. So we've got some Some of our metrics tables have rollups that include JSON, key value pair data basically in a JSON string. So in order to report on that, I have to parse the JSON. So the original way I did that was with common schema, which has some stored procs for JSON parsing, so that's cool. But then, eventually what I learned is that's really slow, because stored procedures, if you're running it on a large result set on every row, it's super slow. So I found the MySQL JSON UDFs, which Oracle wrote. They're on the labs.mysql.com page. They're experimental. They have all sorts of warnings. Don't use these in production, or else, everything's going to catch on fire. But I've found for my simple use case, since that's a UDF, it's built into the server, it's written in C++, it's like 100 times faster than common schema. So for my use case, I'd say MySQL JSON UDFs are the winner. So in conclusion, be a boss, like I said. Follow my program, 4 steps to success. Always look for a better way. This is important. Once you got a problem solved, it's good to look for a different way to do it, whether it's something built in natively in the database, like I talked about with some of the new cool stuff in 5.6, or whether it's finding a different tool to do the same job. And then, share your experiences with the community. So this is one that I feel really passionately about, is that, this is a contribution I can make, is showing people the way that I've used tools to solve problems. I happen to like to blog. Not everybody likes to blog, but you can, talk to your coworkers about it. You can, do it on Stack Overflow. Whatever's, however you want to communicate. But I feel like, in order to be good consumers of tools and good citizens of the MySQL community and sort of give back to the community, it's good to share. So that's a big one for me. So that is my talk. If you want to reach me on email, I'm there. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm IOWalker. And like I said, I blog a lot, mostly about MySQL, at mechanics.flite.com. And we are hiring, so in particular at Flite right now. Like I said, we're in San Francisco. We're looking for a back-end Java engineer and a DevOps engineer. So it's a great team to work with. We've got some folks from Flite in the corner, so if anybody's interested, you can find us afterwards and talk about it. And so that's it for my deck. So we can open up to questions. I can stick around if anybody has questions. Yes. I will do that. So somebody has to ask a question so I can repeat it.
Woo! Yeah!
Yes, Aaron. Yeah. 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 So how are you running? You're running it basically, but are you just running it across all schemas, all tables at the top? But are you just doing a single table, or are you just saying checksum everything? And it just never finishes? Yeah. Yes. So I'm supposed to repeat the question. I forgot that part. So the question is, PT table checksum. Aaron's running it on a really gnarly schema, and it never finishes. Some of the tables don't have primary keys. Some of them have MD5 primary keys. So all of them have, yeah. So the question is, what do you do in that case? So yeah, there may be some secrets. The PT table checksum is actually one of my favorite documentation pages in Percona Toolkit, because it has these like very vague statements like, for PT table checksum is written in a way in which it will almost always do the right thing on its own. Which it kind of gives you the warm fuzzies, but makes you, it's maybe not, yes. So yeah, I haven't done a lot with any of the fancy options on PT table checksum. I know it's complained about some of my indexes that it's like, because it does, basically it figures out what queries it's going to run. So it does the checksums in chunks, right? So it says, insert into my checksum table, select these 1,000 rows and checksum them. So it's an insert select. And before it runs the select, it does an explain, because it wants to figure out, is it going to be slow or fast. So sometimes it's complained to me and said, I can't figure out the right index to use, it's going to be slow. So there's options to say, ignore that. I haven't looked that much at how you can sort of hold its hand and prod it, and I haven't looked at running it with a specific schema like that. So I'm sure there's lots of options. Yeah, I know going to the documentation pages for Percona Toolkit, it can be kind of a sad and lonely place to be. But I've found that just sort of playing around with different options in a test environment is the best way I've figured out things to do like that.
Some interesting options for it are you can tell it to like run for a certain number of hours, and it'll just run for that long, and then you can kind of like see how well it's done.
The problem is I get slave lag immediately.
Yeah, like
Even though I configured that function and I configured the chunks,
yeah.
I'm just used to having ints as primary keys, so my big chunk size.
Yeah, it's hard to slow
My
down.
switches are geared towards ints and not MD5s.
Yeah, it sounds like you have data discrepancies, but your schema is trying to hide them from you really hard.
That is, I know that is what's going on. I'm open to hints.
Yes. So
Google's not my friend.
yeah, I'll do some research afterwards and see if I can find something for you on that. Other questions? Or what's that?
Truncate table.
Yes.
Drop table will make me happier.
All right. Other questions? Or anybody have ideas on how Aaron can check summer tables?
I have another question.
Yes.
So I'm leery of using the stored procedures. I don't like putting stored procedures in views in my databases because, well, especially this one's pretty gnarly. I don't want to slow it up any more than it is. Are you been coming across that when you're using the common schema?
Okay. So the question is, if you're not comfortable putting views and stored procs in your schema, what do you do? And I'd say, really slow, compared to UDFs, like I mentioned before, but I wouldn't call them harmful at all. And views, are only a problem if they're slow and you're actually querying them. So, installing something like common schema, I wouldn't be afraid of installing common schema. And yeah, that's probably the one you're talking about. It's
What's kept me from using it.
yeah, no, I would embrace common schema, and you have nothing to fear simply from installing it. But as I said, I'm a big fan of common schema, so I'd rather more people install it. So I'll try to convince you to install it rather than scare you away from using it.
You can install it in Sandbox.
There you go.
I'm trying to convince every developer where I work to use Sandbox.
Yeah. So we've got common schema on all of our databases, and it hasn't been a problem. It's been great. We use it mostly for maintenance stuff. There's nothing in our application using common schema, but I've found it super useful for maintenance. And actually, the MySQL JSON UDFs I've been a little more hesitant to spread. We've got it on one, reporting slave database, which I felt like was a pretty harmless place to put it. But one of our developers has been pushing a use case where we might have to put it on more of our reporting databases, which should be fine. The way I'm using the MySQL JSON UDFs is it's read-only. It's just extracting a single value from a key value pair, more or less. So that's not too bad. Yeah. But yeah, no, common schema is very safe. I would install it. And yeah, so we actually had an issue with one of our databases yesterday where I was sitting down with a developer, and it was cool. I was thinking about this talk tonight and all the different tools that we use. And as the issue came up yesterday, we had some slow queries getting logged, so I used PT Query Digest to summarize those. And then there were some long-running queries that we had to kill, so I used PT Kill for that. And then I found out that there were some indexes with the columns in the wrong order in some of our reporting roll-up tables, and so I wanted to write some DDL to fix that. But it was, there was a lot of tables. It's a big schema, so how do I find all the ones? So then I actually used common schema. So common schema has a view called _unique keys, which is, anything prefixed with an underscore is something that Shlomi created to sort of for internal use, but I've found that those are some of the great secret weapons of common schema. is to use the underscore stuff. So I used the underscore unique keys one to identify the tables, you know, because it showed the order of the columns to identify those, and then I dynamic alter table statements that then I could run in, you know, pt-online-schema-change, or in my case, I was running on passive DB, so it's just alter tables. So it was kind of cool that I was, you know, sitting there yesterday using all these tools together, you know, in anticipation of this talk. So, but that's an example of a, you know, a lot of the stuff I use common schema for is like things that information schema doesn't do or only sort of half does, but common schema makes it easier or better. You know, a lot of times when I'm querying information schema to do something, you know, I'm halfway done writing my query and I realize I was like, you know what, common schema probably has this, and then I go and check, and, you know, half the time it does. So that's the kind of stuff that it's good for. Other questions? Is anybody here using common schema other than me? No? You should? Yes, there you go. Sure. Nice. Yes. You won't be sorry. Okay, how many people here are using Percona Toolkit? So, one person not using Percona Toolkit, yeah. So that, I mean, that's what I figure, Percona Toolkit. Because I look at how many people use Percona Toolkit, but then I try to look for blog posts about it or even like bug reports in their bug system, and there's not that many of them. So I think there's this gap from like these, you know, super useful tools that so many people are using, but like nobody's talking about them and like solving each other's problems. So that's part of the gap that I'm trying to bridge with my methodology, is that, you know, if you're using a tool, talk about it, tell people about it, you know, it makes the community better and ultimately makes the tools better as well. Yeah. Yeah, but it's not easy to find if it's buried in a slide deck of secret undocumented features. Yeah, and you know, like I said, I've used all the Percona Toolkit tools at least once just to do it, and that's been very educational. The one tool I will say that I haven't gotten to work is PT index usage. Does anybody use PT index usage? Yeah, so PT index usage, you feed it a slow query log, and it tells you what indexes would be used by it theoretically, but I've always gotten all sorts of Perl errors and stuff when I do it, so there's something fishy about that tool, so I don't know. But that was the one when I actually went back through today and tried it and couldn't get it to work, but most of the stuff from Percona Toolkit is pretty cool. I mean, there's a bunch of different sort of classes of tools in it, you know, that there's some that are more system related. Like there's the disk summary, which is like sort of like a souped up IO stat that's particularly good for databases. That's a good one to use. Like if one of our EC2 instances or the EBS volume that's attached to it is acting up, PT disk summary is a good way to get some quick visibility into that. There's PT FIFO split, which has nothing to do with databases. It just basically takes a file and chunks it up. That's one that I love to use for load data in file. You know, if I've got some input files of sort of arbitrarily that might be millions of rows, might be hundreds. I want to standardize a certain chunk size, whatever's optimal for load data in file. I use PT FIFO split for that. That's pretty cool. And then there's a lot of tools that I feel like are sort of designed as when Percona is doing consulting engagements, and they go in and like you're going in totally cold on a database. You know, you've never seen the schema before, you don't know anything about it. So it's got a lot of tools that are sort of the first pass that you run it, and it just sort of gives you the lay of the land and shines some light on the dark corners of the schema. And you know, you really do have to think what it was written for when you use it too, because some of them can be a little misleading, like the PT variable advisor, right? The name makes it sound like it's very prescriptive, like it's like, you know, you run it and it'll tell you exactly to set all your variables in your my.cnf, but it's really not written for that at all. It's just sort of to be like, look for things that are a little fishy, you know. So you run it, you go, you know, you're looking at a database for the first time, you run it, and it just sort of, it basically shows you where they change the defaults or, you know, set things a little differently than other people to just sort of give you, you know, give you an idea. about what might be a problem. But as you know, you can't come up with a one-size-fits-all my.cnf. And if you try, it usually means trouble. But so that's the other thing I try to do with these tools is sort of think about who wrote them and why they wrote them, so I can understand how relevant it is to me and what's the tool really doing. Any other questions?
I guess we're done, and it's raffle time. And I just have some T-shirts, sorry. But we don't have tickets. So, Mike, how are we going to do this? So I did bring a variety of sizes because last meetup people were very sad. I guess our T-shirts are cool. And I ran out of T-shirts. And I didn't bring any XXLs. Today I did, but y'all seem skinny today compared to last the last meetup. So I don't know how to do this. So should we?
So start counting from the left. 1, 2. There we go.
So 2. Who's 2? Is that Captain Tom?
Start at the left. 1 is number 1. Tom.
3. No, Tom is number 2. 1. Who's 2? Come over. You can get a T-shirt.
Gentleman at the end over there. 7, 8, 9.
Who wants a T-shirt that thinks you're sitting in one of those T-shirts?
First person to install Common Schema gets a T-shirt.
You probably don't want one because you could get one. Tom, do you want a T-shirt? Sure. What size? What size? I got a large for you. Okay, who's sitting in number 7?